I'm always a little cautious when it comes to talking about narrative adventure games, particularly point and click style ones, because while I don't think of spoilers as a serious concern, especially on this channel, I nonetheless do think that if the primary thing you get out of the game experience is the narrative, too much time spent describing or showing that narrative is using up some of what you might want to find in that game. This goes more so for mystery stories and for horror stories. In the case of mystery stories, solving the puzzle and working out why things are the way they are, and feeling clever because you did it on your own, is part of the joy, much in the same way that in a horror story, having the horror creep up on you and crawl up the back of your scalp and rest there, pulsing, is something for the game to control, not me, the person telling you about it. And so, here, examining the excavation of Hobbs Barrow, I find myself reluctant to show you very much of the game at all. And yet, I want to do this as a video. I want you to feel something of this atmosphere, hear this music, and just wait for a while with me while I tell you a story about a story. The excavation of Hobbs Barrow is the next one in the line of really quite good point-and-click narrative adventures released by Wadjet Eye, in this case developed by Cloak and Dagger Games. It's the story of Thomasina Bateman, an antiquarian in Victorian England, who has set out on a life work of writing about the barrows of England. Small hillocks and structures old enough that the histories of them are lost, filled with treasures that speak of times in England's history from well before what we think of as England even existing. The story starts with Thomasina heading out to Bewley to learn about Hobbs Barrow, where a local has invited her to come and inspect an interesting old relic. That's pretty much all you get to kick the story off, except it's also a little bit of a lie, because the story starts with Thomasina going to some sort of sanitarium or hospital facility in the middle of the pouring rain, refusing to talk to anyone, and then the narration kicks in and you are on a train. If you were of the genre, familiar with its particular tropes and structures, you might be wondering if this is more of your Space Quest style, or King's Quest, where death can be immediate and the interface requires you to be specific, or if it is more along the lines of something like Monkey Island or Day of the Tentacle, where you are expected to be playful and the interface has very broad generalities in it. I'd instead point to Beneath a Steel Sky, where the interface is extremely simple. Your character can be mostly directed to look at things or act on things, which can be frustrating when she doesn't do the things you want her to do. Something the game uses to great effect is the way that it is both a classic-looking pixel art kind of game and also very much not a classic pixel art game. Numerous sequences are interrupted with sudden dramatic close-ups on characters' faces and expressions, often in a very unpretty, unflattering way, creating senses of the unnatural and the grotesque about many things that you would just be inclined to see in these very ordinary situations. Much is made of the way that things feel and seem wrong, but much of that can at first be attributed to being in someone's head. There is a clever use of the uncanny in this very interesting little game. I say little because I don't feel that if I go back and replay Hobbs Barrow 5 different times, I will come away with 5 meaningfully different levels of insight, even though the game gives you choices for how you explain yourself to the people of Bewley. The game therefore has more of a feel to me of, for example, a horror movie, where the linear narrative is a thing that you inexorably cannot help but see, slowly but surely clawing its way towards you, and that the end you are seeing in the distance is possibly brighter than you may expect, but also maybe darker than you dare hope. It's folk horror, it's British horror, it is a British story about Britain and the ancient history that lies underneath Britain. It's not something I see a lot of in games of its ilk, and indeed, what it's not is what stood out to me the most. One criticism I've seen of the game, made especially on its Steam page, is that it's predictable, that the story is kind of what you expect going into it. And to an extent, I can understand that, especially if you want to be reductive about it. It is ultimately a horror narrative with a horrifying end and a horrifying subject matter. The fact that you may or may not be inclined to like Thomasina may influence how you see that horror by the end, but much in the same way that we've had a lot of grisly, bloody, horror-driven narrative adventures over the past 15 years, this is yet another one of them. But at the same time, I want to highlight the way that there's something else Hobbs Barrow isn't. Hobbs Barrow is not a game about the horror of the asylum. It is not a game that points to the mentally unwell or the disordered. It is not a game that points to the horror inherent in the deformed or the unnatural kind of person. It isn't horror that looks to the foreigner, to the outsider and the pollutant. It isn't a horror that underpins a sense of the fear of the ocean. In many ways, the thing that I want to most draw to your attention is that Hobbs Barrow is not Lovecraftian. Much can be said about the work of H.P. Lovecraft. He is often a go-to example of a general type of horror these days. If the protagonist is wearing a suit, practically, we get a little bit of that Lovecraftian element involved. But in the case of Hobbs Barrow, the horror is much more old and primal and pagan. To me, much more prominent than any aesthetic of tentacles and time is the way that Hobbs Barrow looks at England and England's history and England's spaces. That there are places on the moors where people can live completely disconnected from other people, despite being relatively close. That alienation is possible from your own people in so small places, and also that people are alienated from their own history. That there are things in the country, under the earth, that are as old as bones, that do not have any line connecting them to the future, but the most tenuous grasps from the faintest memories. Hobbs Barrow is a story that leans not on tired tropes, not on racism and the other, in what it finds horrifying. What it finds horrifying is what was already here, what we always were, and what it is that you can lose of yourself. It's not a story about the dead coming back to life. It's a story about losing control of yourself when confronted with what you are. I find this interesting and exciting, and I loved that it wasn't so obvious to me, the works that these people were drawing from. I love the imagery it employs. I really like Thomasina as a character, and I liked the tone. I liked sitting still and listening to the rain, or staring out across the mists. Does this forgive the game's occasional ropey puzzles, or the times that you can repeat certain tasks to make sure that you solve the puzzle properly, even though most reasonable people wouldn't let it happen? Is it okay that this story has a few flag-driven events where you just need to ask the right person about something and someone else will show up in a place where you can now find them? I'm personally willing to overlook a few minor weaknesses in the narrative design if the narrative purpose is so clear and so distinct to me? Throughout this whole game, I only had to look up a guide once, and that's at 3 in the morning when I felt like I didn't have it in me to keep investigating. I think that says a lot about how good I thought this game was. I wanted to finish. One puzzle stymied me, and I solved that puzzle with help, but then finished the rest of the game entirely on my own. The Excavation of Hobbs Barrow is not a game that will find you new and exciting territory within the space of the narrative adventure. There is no brilliant interface trick that I haven't seen before, or some clever acceptance of the structure of the narrative adventure with a heroine traveling around talking to everyone and sticking everything in her pants. But as far as mood and tone and style, as far as keeping me engaged and wanting me along on the whole journey of a horror story where I knew something bad was probably going to happen and I couldn't do anything about it, well, it's pretty bloody excellent.